Hi, and welcome back to Democracy Cracks. In this mini-series, we examine the fractures in our democratic systems and what we need to do to heal them. If you've been with me so far, you know we've been slowly peeling back the layers of what makes a democracy stand and what undermines it. We talked about trust, about when disillusionment sinks in, about people walking away, and about all the new forms of participation bubbling up outside traditional politics. And after all that, one question keeps coming back to me. Not just why democracy is cracking, but whether the model itself is still the right size for the world we live in today. Because let's be honest, our democracies were designed for another era, a slower era. A world without social media storms, global crises, climate deadlines, or political decisions that ripple across borders in seconds. So if institutions are struggling, if citizens feel unheard, if participation is shifting into new spaces, maybe the real question isn't what's wrong with democracy, but is it simply overdue for an upgrade? That's where we're headed today. We're going to look at what still works, what's clearly showing its age, and why updating doesn't mean throwing everything away, even if democracies face pressures from outside as well as within. We will also explore some participatory initiatives, not as miracle cures, but as ideas that can help us understand how democracy might adapt. All right, let's jump in. When some people say that democracy feels out of sync with the times, they're not imagining it. A lot of our institutions were indeed built for a world far less interconnected than today. And why does that matter? Because these cracks in the system aren't just abstract concerns of political scientists. They shape how people feel about democracy itself. Think of this. In Spain, 21% of people today describe Franco's dictatorship as good or even very good. And among young people, 14% say today's democracy is worse than the dictatorship. 35% of young Luxembourgers say they're unsure or simply don't believe that democracy is the best form of government. When you hear numbers like this, you start to realize that the everything is broken narrative isn't just background noise. It's actually shaping how whole generations see democracy. That's exactly what Ophélie explained when we talked. She wasn't longing for the past, and she wasn't fantasizing about some shiny, tech-driven future either. She simply pointed out that democracies were never meant to be frozen in time. They have always evolved. They have always adapted. And they can do it again.
Some of the systems we came up with some decades, sometimes centuries ago, are not crafted for the type of challenges that we're facing at the moment, but for the challenges that we are likely to be facing in the future as well. That being said, I think it's very difficult to analyze democratic systems from a general point of view and say, this we can keep, this we can't keep. And I think what is actually required is more of a general consideration for what is it we need instead of relying on, but we've done it this way for this amount of time.
She's right. If you look at the pace of change around us, the speed of information, global markets, climate disruptions, technologies that rewrite entire sectors overnight, it becomes obvious that a system designed for simpler times is under enormous pressure. Because it was built with different assumptions about how society works, how citizens participate, and how fast decisions need to be made. And yet, as Ophélie highlighted, none of this means we're stuck.
And when you look at France as a country, it changed the systems more than 10 times over the past 300 years. And so whenever we hear in the common general debate that There's nothing that we can change that much, because then it would mean that we would put all of the system back into question. We've done that. We've been doing that for 300 years, for the last 3 centuries, at least in France. And when you look at the European institutions and you put them in perspectives with other democratic systems, they're actually not that old. So I think it's very important to realize that we can change all of that.
I love this point because it flips the usual narrative. Instead of seeing democracy as a fragile glass that might shatter if we touch it, Ophélie sees it as something alive, something that's been redesigned, rewritten, and reimagined over and over again. And maybe that's exactly what we need right now. Not panic, not nostalgia, but the confidence that updating democracy isn't a problem. But this is not only about institutions. The other part of the diagnosis is deeper. Because even the best designed institutions struggle when the environment around them becomes unstable. This is why diagnosing democracy is complicated. Some issues might come from outdated structures, but many come from the pressures we place on those structures. And not all of those pressures are internal. When we talk about external threat to democracy, it's tempting to think it's abstract, involving only distant actors in a faraway big geopolitical game. But foreign interference is not a background issue anymore. It's right there, pressing on democratic systems every day. And it's one of the most persistent pressures they face. According to the European External Action Service, these foreign manipulation campaigns now reach every EU member state systematically. In 2024 alone, over 500 coordinated incidents were reported, involving tens of thousands of online channels and more than 60,000 individual pieces of content. Elections are an obvious focus. During the 2024 European Parliament election, investigators flagged dozens of interference cases. The same playbook showed up around the US presidential election, in Moldova for both the presidential race and the EU accession referendum, in Georgia's parliamentary elections, and in national elections in France and Romania. And it's important to be clear about this. The vast majority of these operations are traced back to pro-Kremlin networks. What's also important to understand is that these campaigns aren't really about selling people one big lie. Their goal is worse. They amplify distrust and deepen polarization. They push the idea that nothing is reliable, that everyone lies, that democratic institutions are either incompetent or corrupt. In other words, they don't create cracks in democracy. They widen the ones that already exist. That's why external threats aren't just a matter of security or foreign policy. They strike at the very conditions that allow democracy to function and to evolve. This is where Kelsey's point comes in.
I think that when you have a democratic project that's as large as the EU, you are just working with people with very different idea points, and then it makes it easier to sort of exploit said fractures. But now is the moment where the EU is actually, probably since the Second World War, the most important, because it is also unifying these member states. It can provide this type of structure, it can provide this type of support if it has the ability to do so and the ability to be a strong EU against these counter forces. So I actually still think that in some ways this might strengthen both positive opinions from citizens, but also like the role that the EU plays in the world. Why not make this moment of greatness and not turn it into yet another continent dissolving, basically? That would be my rallying call.
And the EU is a particularly revealing case. On the one hand, it is often criticized for being slow, complex, and distant. But on the other hand, external pressure can sometimes have an unexpected effect. During moments of crisis, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for instance, the most recent Eurobarometer survey shows increases in support for EU-level cooperation, including more than 80% of citizens being in favor of a common defense and security policy. In other words, External threats can also remind citizens why collective democratic structures matter. But this effect doesn't last automatically. As Kelsey warned, resilience isn't guaranteed. It has to be actively built through credible leadership, coordination, and institutions that live up to their democratic promises.
I think that the EU really, really needs to play a strong role at this moment. There's been a complete reshifting of power balances, as we're all aware, and I'm not sure that the EU necessarily came out on top of that. I think that actually the EU has an incredibly important role to be a leader, to unify member states, which are very fractured at this moment, also within the EU, and to really prove that it can live up to its ideals. I think this is the moment to do it now. There's really no other option.
I appreciate that we are being clear on the diagnosis. Some countries, especially Russia, are working hard to undermine democratic ideals. This is not only about profiting from political disillusionment. It's also about destroying the fundamental rights and values our societies are built upon, with Ukraine being a prime example. And clearly, it does not help that the US under Trump 2.0 is aligning with this, with support from some EU member states themselves, such as Hungary. How can our democracies adapt without tearing themselves apart? How can they bend without breaking? So once we accept that democracy isn't carved in stone and that external pressures create and exacerbate problems, the next question is pretty simple. What do we actually do about it? Over the past few years, there's been a real wave of experimentation. Citizens' assemblies, participatory budgets, digital consultations, all of them are presented as ways to reconnect people to decision-making, to make politics feel closer and more responsive. But experimenting also brings some uncomfortable questions with it. Does adding new participatory tools make democracy stronger or messier, more inclusive or harder to govern? That tension came up very clearly in my conversation with Ophélie.
I think the way tools have been used changed, for sure. If you look at the use of referendums at the beginning of the Fifth Republic in France, they were used a lot more than they were ever used in the last 25 years. I'll keep France as a good example at the moment of this discrepancy between what the people want and what the people in power are deciding to do. For example, there was this poll that I heard of, 86% of the people who think that ultra-rich should be taxed more. And, well, the current government is non-existent, but the government that just fell kept on thinking that we shouldn't. And so here is when the tension becomes wider and wider, is you have been elected, and then there's a question of how much legitimacy do you have based on how you were elected, which is very much the issue when it comes to the French situation at the moment. But also, what is your legitimacy in trying to pass agendas that are far from what the people who elected you wanted, let alone the people who didn't elect you? I'm not saying that we should use referendum every now and then, because of course it's a tool that needs to be used quite carefully.
What she's pointing to is something we see across many democracies today, and something we have already touched on in earlier episodes. Elections still take place. Governments are legitimate on paper. But between one vote and the next, a gap opens up between what people say they want and what politics actually deliver. That's where participatory experiments enter the picture. They bring together randomly selected citizens, give them time, information, and space to deliberate. And they ask them to grapple with trade-off, not just express opinions. This is especially important as in 2023, only about 3 in 10 people across OECD countries felt their political systems really gave them a say. Among young people, the disconnect is even stronger. In the 2021 European Parliament's Youth Survey, around 70% said they felt they had very little influence over decisions affecting the EU, and that decision makers weren't really listening to them, We heard the same during the ActEU Youth Labs, which brought together more than 300 young people across 10 European countries. Again and again, participants said the same thing. They want a greater say in politics and more opportunities to be directly involved. The OECD's work on trust and public decision-making shows that decisions shaped by ordinary citizens tend to feel more legitimate than those taken behind closed doors. Trust also works both ways. For governments to build trust, they also have to show a bit of trust themselves to let citizens in. And for people who take part, that experience often changes things. It makes the complexity of collective decisions more visible. And it can create a stronger feeling that democracy is something we all share. In Ireland, for example, surveys after citizen assemblies showed something striking. People were more willing to accept political decisions taken in participatory settings, even decisions they didn't personally like. This was particularly the case for those who were the most skeptical about democracy to begin with. But, and this is very important, everything depends on what happens next. When recommendations are ignored or simply fade away without any explanation, the effect can be the opposite. Instead of rebuilding trust, it leaves people feeling even more disillusioned. The Conference on the Future of Europe is often mentioned in this context. For an entire year, the EU organized citizen-led debates and discussions to come up with proposals on how to shape the future. Thousands of citizens took part. They shared ideas, invested time. And yet, what happened to their contributions, or whether they made any real difference to EU policies, is still not clear. So can these participatory processes be considered as a miracle solution? That's usually where skepticism sets in.
To be honest, I'm a bit skeptical if this kind of assemblies is the right way for the European Union to go. And I believe also the Conference of Europe was not really a success. But at the local level, I think that makes a lot of sense, because at the local level, you can get the most people. It's also the least costly.
What Alex is really pointing to is something we see quite often. These democratic experiments tend to work best when they're close enough for people to see a clear link between taking part and what actually changes. At the local level, schools, transports, housing, public space, participation can feel real and concrete. At the EU level, that link is much harder to grasp. There's another tension we can't ignore. Participatory tools are often presented as a fix for representative democracy, but they can't replace it. Assemblies don't govern. Referendums don't negotiate. And when new tools are added without clear rules about who decides what and how, things can get messy. More voices don't automatically mean better decisions. Without coordination, responsiveness turns into noise. Without follow-up, participation turns into frustration. Oh. So the challenge isn't choosing between representative democracy and participatory democracy. It's working out how the two can actually support each other without throwing the whole system off balance. As we already discussed, democracy has always evolved and adapted. But what feels different today is the pressure. That's why we need to think about resilience or adaptability, not only in technical terms, but also as a cultural shift. It's about whether democracies can think beyond the next vote, the next crisis, or the next headline. Kelsey talked about this when she mentioned intergenerational fairness. The idea that democracy should also speak for people who aren't voting yet, or who aren't even born.
So we're working on future generations, and in some ways we've seen some progress. We see a commissioner now, Metcalfe, for intergenerational fairness. We know that there are actually permanent bodies in countries like Wales. I think it will probably rely on civil society and researchers. I don't necessarily think the politicians themselves will be coming and making a 45-year policy. It would be amazing to have. That's essentially the goal. Or not even 45 years. We're thinking really long term, 100 years. What does the world look like?
I don't know about you, but this is something I had never really considered. Clearly, we don't have all the answers, and the evidence is still emerging. But what we do know is this. Declining democracy is not the only existential risk our societies face in the long run. There is also the interlinked challenge of climate change and biodiversity loss. And that's without even getting into pervasive digital transformations or the demographic pressures of an aging population. So maybe we need to think about adaptability in the long term and take action today to secure the future for everyone. Maybe it's about slowing things down to make room for deliberation and opening up participation without pretending that it can replace responsibility on its own. That balance is fragile. A democracy that reacts to everything risks instability. A democracy that refuses to evolve risks becoming irrelevant. So yes, democracy does need an update. Understood as careful, open, and constant adjustment. The key is to hold on to its core promises, not only to survive the future, but to help shape it. Let's pause here for today. We've seen that some of today's problems come from outdated rules. Others come from the weight we place on democratic systems. Inequality, polarization, disinformation, geopolitical tension. And we've seen that reforms and experiments can help, but only if they're taken seriously, followed through, and embedded into the system instead of floating around it. What this episode really leaves me with is a tension. A very real tension. We want democracies to be more responsive, more inclusive, more open. But at the same time, we also expect them to provide stability, legitimacy, and a sense of responsibility. And unfortunately, those things don't always pull in the same direction. So maybe that's the real challenge. Not finding the perfect model, but learning how to live with that tension without giving up on the democratic project itself. And importantly, this is not where the story ends. Because when you start pulling on these threads, another set of questions inevitably follows. If democracy is under pressure from the inside and from the outside, what can still be done? Where is there room to act, to protect, to strengthen what already exists? And what, realistically, gives us reasons not for naive optimism, but for cautious hope? That's what we will explore in the final episode of Democracy Cracks. Before we close, a quick reminder. Democracy Cracks is produced by TEPSA as part of the Horizon Europe project ActEU. I'm Eva Ribera, Program Manager at TEPSA, and I'm the one behind this series. If you are curious about the data, studies, or research that inform what you've heard today, you will find all the references in the episode description. And if anything in this episode made you think, smile, question, or disagree, please reach out. I'm always happy to hear from you. See you next time.